All right, hello again, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about identity and ethics. So this is either our first or second installment on this subject, and we're going to be talking about Susan Brison's "Outliving Oneself." So we're going to see how trauma victims, right? We may have special responsibilities to trauma victims in virtue of the fact that the traumatic experience that they have sort of breaks their identity in a morally very relevant way. Um, so just sort of a precursor here, we're going to be talking about some very serious material. And so feel free to fast forward if you feel uncomfortable at certain points in the video. So, so let's talk about the relationship between identity and ethics. We saw in the last reading, the Placencia reading, that how we address people can fog up a moral conversation, right? So illegal and undocumented immigrant, right? Sort of cloud and bias us from the very outset of the conversation. So rather formally and informally authorized, Placencia argues, help clear up some of the moral presuppositions that we have going into the immigration discussion. So so Brison's also going to be addressing how identity and ethics overlap in a relevant way, because she wants to say that, look, our relationships constitute our personal identity, and certain traumatic experiences can break apart our relations, our relationship with our bodies, our relationship with other people, our relationship with our roles, right? And so as a consequence of this, we may owe trauma victims special moral things that we say wouldn't owe to people who have been harmed in other sorts of ways, right? So trauma seems to be a very special case of harm. And we owe trauma victims perhaps more things or different things than we owe to the victims of say, non-traumatic harm. Okay, so how do we conceive of ourselves, right? So here are three potential options, right? So first of all, we have what's the atomistic self. So this is kind of the Kantian view of self. John Locke kind of has a view of self that's similar to this. I think Rawls, in a lot of ways, has this assumption. And so the idea here is that the self is, or you and me, we're both isolated individuals, right? We are fundamentally independent of one another. There's something about me that makes me who I am, and there's something about you who makes you who you are, or whatever that feature is, right? Whether it's our memories, whether it's our soul, whether it's our brain, right? We have the same brain, right? Over time, whether or not it's our body that makes us who we are, there's something fundamentally independent of other people that makes us who we are. And then, of course, we have this Buddhist doctrine of no self, right? Rather, we address one another as I and you, right? And these are merely conventional truths, whereas the ultimate truth is that selfhood is really an illusion, and the goal of the Buddhist religion is to sort of bleed out of yourself, right? And by becoming a Buddha, in some Buddhist traditions. At any rate, though, the idea here is that there isn't really any self, essentially, that is sort of, there's nothing but emptiness about us. We're not going to be talking about that one in particular, but we're going to be posing the atomistic conception of self against what Brison calls the relational conception of self. So the idea is that, look, there's something about about us that makes us who we are, but there's all of these other things that make us who we are as well. We are who we are in virtue of our relationships with our friends, in virtue of the relationship that we have with our bodies, in virtue of the various roles and actions that we perform. So I am your course instructor. That kind of in part makes me who I am. And as a result, if I were to say, not be your course instructor anymore, I would lose, like, say, a piece of myself, we might say, on this conception. So what we essentially are is a web of relationships and roles. So we're moving on into the text from Brison. So let's see here. So let's first of all think about harm. Harm is defined as this, the term is the counterfactual comparative count of harm. So you harm someone when you make someone worse off than they would have been otherwise if you hadn't, say, kicked him in the shin, right? So suppose I'm going to kick you in the shin, bam, kick you in the shin. I've made you worse off because you're like, oh, my shin. I've made you worse off than you would be had I refrained from kicking you in the shin, right? So you're better off if I refrain from kicking you in the shin. And so this means that we have to look at two scenarios, right? One where I kick you and one where I don't kick you, and see which one you're better off in, right? Generally, pain makes us worse off. So it seems like you're better off in the scenario where I don't kick you than in the one that I do kick you, right? So trauma is a special kind of harm. Brison says that a traumatic event is one in which a person feels utterly helpless in the face of a force that is perceived as life-threatening, right? So when we undergo these traumatic experiences, we feel as though we feel a kind of gravity that death is imminent, right? And it's all at the hands of, say, another person or some sort of event, right? So we're confronting evil in a very relevant way and significant way, morally significant way. And so trauma can change us in a lot of ways. So Brison, she was attacked in France and beaten up and left for dead and raped and kidnapped. And it was really horrible. It was a horrible experience for her. And she talks about that extensively in this text. And the trauma changed all of these things about herself. They changed how she related with other people, how she saw her own body, right? And so trauma sort of leaves us with all of this baggage, right? And all of this baggage is morally relevant. And all of this baggage also separates us and changes our identity in morally relevant ways, right? Okay, so let's think about Brison's three sort of senses of self. First of all, she thinks that the self is embodied, right? So we have a relationship with one's body. We have a relationship with our own body, right? So our body is the source of pleasure and the source of pain. And so when our bodies give us pleasure, we kind of build this trust with our bodies, right? We feel ashamed or proud of our bodies. And so we are sort of viewing our own bodies as in a kind of relationship, right? And so the way in which trauma can affect this, affect our embodied self is that the traumatic experience can make us distrust our own bodies, right? So according to Brison, our bodies are the source of pain from a traumatic experience, right? Such that we are hesitant to trust our body after a traumatic experience. So in her own case, she cut her hair after she was kidnapped. She started wearing bigger, baggier clothes as to not advertise her body to other people, and so as potentially to deter a future attacker, right? So you can see how she becomes ashamed of her own body in virtue of the traumatic experiences that she suffered. Okay, the second thing is the narrative self. So one of the ways in which um, one of the ways in which we relate to other people and to ourselves is by telling ourselves stories, right? We have these archetypal stories of, like, say, the hero on a quest, right? The person that's in distress and we save them, or we are saved by the heroic person, right? There's all sorts of these archetypal stories, and so we interpret our lives in many ways through these kinds of narratives, right? We kind of get a sense of who we are by these stories. And so when someone is undergoes some trauma, all of a sudden that narrative just explodes in the sense that um, the narrative is sort of cut off and has to be reconstituted over time. So when we undergo these traumatic experiences, we sort of shatter what it was that we previously were before the traumatic experience. So, for instance, if you've ever gone through a divorce, divorce is really hard for folks because they are leaving so much of the life that they had previously, right? And so the web of relationships and narratives that people who previously had when they were married, all of that's cut off and sort of gone. And so you have to rebuild your narrative. You have to rebuild your identity. And traumatic victims of trauma or victims of traumatic experiences undergo the same sort of thing. And then lastly, the autonomous self. So this is the kind of self that Kant thinks about, and Locke and Rawls. So the self is essentially sort of an actor. We do actions. We can set goals for ourselves. We can do different things that we want to do, right? And so Brison wants to say that trauma affects our autonomy in a relevant way. So in her case, she couldn't go into a parking lot after dark anymore. She couldn't go out to bars on just off campus, right, where there are dark alleys and stuff. And so she developed a kind of fear for these places, and rightfully so, because of where those places have gotten her in the past, right? So her autonomy is severely limited by the fact that she underwent these horrible experiences. Okay, and so this is just a little bit of her argument here in the piece. So trauma shows us that the mind can't be distinct from the body as the source of self, right? So she wants to say that her traumatic reactions, her trauma responses, are bodily responses as well as mental responses. So the body and the mind are really just one thing, right? And so our body is partly constitutive of ourself, our relationship with our body. Premise two, trauma shows us that the self is not a unitary thing, but a series of episodes and events. So this is that narrative conception of self where we sort of go back and reflect upon previous stories in our lives. And then trauma also shows us that we are not as autonomous as we might think. So when we undergo a traumatic experience, our autonomy is severely sort of limited. And so she wants to say that the best way to make sense of the self, given the lessons from trauma, is to appeal to a relational identity. What I've been talking about sort of this whole time is a relational conception of self. And so she says that our interdependency with others helps us make sense of what happens in response to trauma, as well as how to overcome it. And then finally, the conclusion, a relational commitment not only helps explain harm, but also helps give a better picture of our moral obligations to non-trauma victims have in responding to these harms that might otherwise be overlooked, right? So she wants to say that we have a moral responsibility to restore the autonomy of an individual who's undergone a traumatic experience, right? So she says that her university put lights up in the parking lot after her experience, right? So, and so that helped her restore her autonomy, right? She wasn't quite as afraid to walk through the parking lot at night because of the lights, and she could kind of see what was going on and get to her car, right? So we can gradually sort of build somebody's autonomy back. And so she also talks extensively about the survivors of the Holocaust and the traumatic experiences that they sort of have shared, right? They sort of talk about how they died at the Holocaust, but they didn't really die, right? They're still there, but who they were before the Holocaust has died, right? And so she thinks that for these people who have undergone traumatic experiences on this kind of grand scale, we make a commitment. We're obligated. Non-trauma victims are committed to or morally obligated to sort of say no to letting something like that happen again, right? And in a way, you're recognizing that person's trauma and then trying to say that, look, we won't let this happen again, right? So there's another question. So we might ask about whether or not her argument can apply to, say, other sorts of cases where somebody doesn't have trauma. But anyway, that's all that I have for you all today. Thank you so much.